This is a story of something that my dad witnessed unfold when he was a kid in northern Texas. He was born and grew up on his family's farm until he was drafted to fight in Vietnam. In that neck of the woods, most of your neighbors' farms may be over 5 miles away, but the neighborly spirit of helpfulness meant all one had to do was ask and assistance would be given without a second thought. There was an exception to that rule, however. The 2 landowners located to the north of his family's place had been at war since some said the Civil War. One farmer had been a loyal Democrat and slave owner, while the other was supposedly the head of a recently arrived Yankee family who was a supporter of Abraham Lincoln and the newly formed Republican Party. The Yankees were also wealthy and had purchased a large plot of land that the other farmer had his eyes on for some time. Like so many other families at that time and in that part of Texas, what started off as a disagreement over politics, the coming war would only serve to worsen. Upon the end of that bloody conflict, and with the return of both men from fighting in it, those in the surrounding area hoped the differences between them would be squashed, but this was not to be. The bitterness that had always been there, seething just below the surface, would break free anew after a dispute over a property line sprang up. Josiah Campbell, the patriarch of the pro-Union Campbell clan, had purchased a 500-acre piece of land just before the war had broken out. This large parcel adjoined to his neighbor to the east, Samuel Johnson's property, but it wasn't until 1883 when Campbell began to put in fencing to keep his neighbor's cattle from encroaching onto his land, did the already hostile relationship between the 2 landowners reach a new and dangerous boiling point. Multiple face-to-face confrontations would ultimately lead to a court battle in which Campbell would come out the victor. If Campbell believed the court's judgment would be the end of the argument between the 2 families, he would be proven terribly wrong. Many more disagreements, some of them over insignificant things, would arise in the following generations. One of the more notable involved Josiah, now an octogenarian grandfather, in which a stray bullet would come very close to striking him. Although most in the area assumed Samuel or one of his sons fired the bullet, it could never be proven. Incidents similar to this would only serve to keep the bad blood between the families just hot enough. My family's part in this drama is small. Financially and politically, our lot was similar to that of the Johnsons, a native Southern family arriving in Texas during the Republican period from Tennessee. However, that's where the similarities ended. From what has been passed down through the generations, Samuel Johnson and most of his offspring were ignorant and always looking for a fight. One specific story claims that my great-great-grandfather even stopped attending church because of them. Their attempt at avoiding any involvement in this whole mess was well fought, at least until a quiet morning in 1962, when they would be pulled into it whether they liked it or not. It was a warm June morning. My dad and his family went to church like usual. Everything was normal that day except for the conspicuous absence of the Campbell family. The section they had been sitting in since the building of the church was glaringly empty. Because of this, mutterings quickly began to spread throughout the congregation. The Johnsons sat quietly in their own section, doing their best to ignore the rumblings around them. The Reverend waited but was eventually forced to go on with the service. On the drive home, the family passed the Campbell place expecting to see the bustle of the daily work and those involved in doing it. However, not a soul was seen, and the house sat still, showing no life within. My grandfather dropped the woman off at the house, and he and my dad returned to the Campbell place to take a closer look around. As they approached the home, the uncomfortable silence was broken by the slamming of a screen door. It had been left open and free to swing in the wind. The noise brought out the livestock, and their incessant mooing showed they had yet to be fed or milked. If this was truly the case, something had to be very wrong inside. My dad ran into the barn and fed them quickly and rejoined his dad at the door. They were able to enter with no problems. Unlocked doors were still a common practice in those parts, but that would soon change. There were no signs of life in the back part of the house. My grandfather called out but received no answer. If anyone was still alive inside, The creaking of the stairs as they climbed them certainly would have caused them to stir, but no one appeared. The two men separated as they reached the landing, each heading for different closed doors. Just by chance, my father was the first to discover the fate of the Campbell clan. Two small bodies laid still. In their little blood-soaked beds, John Jr. and William had been shot repeatedly as they slept. Upon taking in the sight, my dad rushed from the room, battling the urge to throw up. He was still just barely out of childhood himself, and yet to have witnessed something so horrible. His father was just about to enter the bedroom of the Campbell parents when his son came rushing from the room. Although no words were exchanged between the two, my grandfather knew what horrors the room behind him likely held. The scene in the parents' room was much like that of the children. Both elder Campbells laid motionless and bloody in their large Victorian bed. They had both been shot with a shotgun to the head, but John Sr., the patriarch, had been shot several more times, so much so it was impossible to definitively identify him. Despite this, there was no doubt the heinously slaughtered man was indeed John Campbell, and the man behind the shotgun was his lifelong adversary, Matthew Johnson. The ill-tempered Matthew's absence from this morning's service was almost as noticeable as that of the Campbells. The manhunt that followed didn't last long. Matthew's body was found hanging in the loft of the barn, and it was clear that he took his own life. The motive behind the terrible act, more than likely, was the latest in their long string of court battles. This time the Campbells found it necessary to bring Matthew into another expansive and drawn-out case over the water rights along the long-disputed property line the two families shared. After more than 3 years of fighting, the Johnsons would ultimately come up on the short end of the stick. What would have been just another link in the chain that had connected the two farm dynasties for over 100 years proved to be the end of the Johnson family's hold on their land. It was later discovered that they had been barely managing to keep their heads above water from harvest to harvest, and John Campbell's suit and their eventual loss was the final blow. Once Matthew no longer had anything left to lose, the century-old bitterness between the neighboring families broke free and gave him the justification many of those before him lacked. His family told the sheriff all she claimed she knew. Her husband had stepped out just after sundown, only to return 2 hours later with a substantial bit of blood on his shirt. She stood by their bedroom window and watched as he burned those same clothes. After he finished this, he came to bed and went to sleep like normal. However, the next morning when she awoke, Matthew was not in the bed next to her. She searched the farm, but he was nowhere to be found. The family went to church like normal because she feared their absence would cause people to talk. She swore she had no idea what her husband was going to do when he left that evening or what he had done when he returned. It was clear he had done something dark, but his target wasn't known. The remaining members of the Johnson family held an auction for their few valuables and vacated the property soon after. Dad said that they were rumored to be living in Wichita Falls and Matthew's wife had remarried, but once he went off to war, he never heard anything else about them. The ownership of their former homestead and adjoining land was purchased by a big land company out of Fort Worth, who broke the land up into smaller parcels and sold it off to new buyers. As for the Campbell land, the place would sit empty for many years. The slaughter that took place inside, tainting the value of an otherwise beautiful home. That land, too, would invariably be broken up and become a massive housing subdivision when the area and all the remaining family farms were consumed by the nearby city. The whole sad mess started in May of 2011. I've been living in a 2-bedroom house next to campus for 2 years. No girlfriend to speak of and incredibly lonely. So when Rachel moved in next door, I was praying for a shot. I was so lonely, in fact, her 10-year-old son didn't scare me off. Being a tall, buxom redhead made her my dream girl. I say girl, but she was 30, a woman and almost 8 years older than me. Hellos and how are yous were shared each morning, and I did my utmost to keep her from noticing how creepy and awkward I really was. The way in which I fumbled over my words, as embarrassing as it was, didn't drive her away. As the months compounded, our talks became more personal and I less nervous. Before I knew it, she had asked me to take her out, and I agreed. I was still a poor student, but even with that, our dinner went well and we progressively drew closer and closer. Her son actually turned out to be a cool kid, and he and I would often play video games together. I did my best to not appear as if though I was trying to be a father to him, more of a friend, really. The situation did cause me to wonder why his father wasn't in his life. The possibility of him being dead did enter my mind, and I thought if I asked, it may bring up unresolved issues. The truth would turn out to be far worse. Things really hit the fan when her ex-husband arrived unannounced at her house. I wasn't there when he showed up, but the fight between the two clued me in. At the time, I was just waking up and heard yelling coming from across the street. I peeked through the blinds in time to witness him hitting her across the head and body. This instance would be the first of many and was the moment I knew what we had was over. Long ago, I learned the hard way to not get involved in an argument between partners. If you're lucky, you get out unscathed, but if you try to be the hero, the effort rarely gets rewarded. Even if she would have asked for help, I probably wouldn't have done it, but she never did. In fact, for the remaining time her and her son lived there, no words passed between the two of us. The ex would move in not long after and stayed until they moved out. A few times her and I would share a passing look, her eyes projecting an air of regret and apology, but nothing became of it. I made the choice to move in, just as she had. Many times more I would witness the abuse, and at least once she knew I had. No one was going to save her but herself. I did have one more brief conversation with her son. He let me know his father had returned home from jail and the whole family was about to move across town to a trailer park. This talk was probably more of a way to let me know what happened than a friendly goodbye. I thanked him and said a goodbye myself. They moved the next week, and that was the last time I saw either of them. Despite the overwhelming feeling of loss I carry with me, the truth is she was always too good for me. An unconfident and shy boy was never a match for a beautiful young woman. At least that's what I tell myself. No matter how brief our time together was, it was the best of my life, and I pray nightly I'll feel that joy again. I had a female neighbor as a kid. Her family was a little odd. They do very unsafe things like chuck throwing stars at each other. Normally the stars never struck one of them, except for this one time when the girl threw one at her younger brother and it stuck in the back of his forearm. It wasn't really deep, mind you, but it still was deep enough to not fall out when he moved the arm. Instead of freaking out like any sane 10-year-old would, he laughed and pulled the thing out. Rather than calling it quits for the day, he threw it back at her. For a while, I thought it was because they were half Japanese and that's just what they did, but as I grew up, I realized that they were just crazy people. When I was 16, the girl and I started messing around. I'm not sure how it happened. One day I was hanging out at their house and I realized I was attracted to her. Not long after, we happened to be wrestling around with each other and she pinned me down and began kissing me. It was all uphill from there. Some days, we'd only touch one another's bodies, and some days, it went all the way. We'd been doing our best to hide what we were doing, but one day, her older brother found out and decided to torture me for it. I never could get a straight answer from her on how he found out, but he had, and that was all that mattered. When he first approached me, I lied, but he saw right through me. Next, I began apologizing, but he still said nothing. His silence was terrifying, but not as much as the knife he was holding in his hand. At that moment, I was standing roughly 10 feet away from him. I eventually ran out of things to say, and we just stared at each other. The long seconds started to get to me, and I yelled at him to say something. Instead, he smiled, raised his hand, and threw the knife at me. I instinctively cowered and covered my head, but it sailed above me and hit the wall. There was no way I was going to stick around and become a pincushion, so I fled across the living room. He kept up his silent treatment. It was clearly working. I stopped to turn to look and see where he was. I saw him bend over and pick up the knife. When he'd seen I'd stopped, he threw it. Again. I saw what he was about to do and ran out the front door of the house. I didn't stop this time until I was inside my own house. As I ran into our living room, my mom stopped me and asked why I was running. It wasn't the first time I'd come running into the house, but I must have been horrified looking. I very nearly blurted out, but remembered what had initiated the chase in the first place. Telling my mom anything about what I'd been doing or even admitting I had those type of thoughts scared me much more than having sharp things thrown at me. So I told her I was very thirsty and was running into the kitchen to get a Coke. I'm not sure she believed me, but let it go and I slipped off to the kitchen. Later in the day, my playmate called me to come over, but I swore I'd never go over there again, as long as her brother was around. She didn't know what had happened until I explained it to her. I hoped she'd get mad about how I was treated. Instead, she changed the subject and said she'd come over to my house. It was a little harder to mess around at my place. My folks were always around, at least one of them. I was kind of mad she didn't stick up for me and obviously still shaken from nearly dying, but she was able to take my mind off of all of that rather easily. We took the opportunity to make up when my mom stepped out for a few things, and we continued messing around any chance we had. I did stick by my pledge, however. I didn't step one foot in her house for the remainder of my time living with my folks. College came around in a few years, and other than small visits at holidays, her and I never saw each other after I left. I did run into her older brother during one Thanksgiving. Even though we were both adults now and many years had passed since our talk, the memory of it was still strong and I expected him to chuck a knife at me any second. My next-door neighbor was the best you could dream of. She worked nights and when she was off, rarely made a peep. Her little dog was a concern early on, but I would soon discover it was as quiet as its owner. I'd been at the complex for a year when she told me she found a boyfriend and things were going well. After that, I saw her even less than before and was more than happy to sign another 12-month lease. Things proved to be too good to be true, however. Barely a month into my second year, things began to change drastically next door. Loud arguments were often heard through the walls, and the dog reacted to these as badly as I did. The poor little guy barked his head off while she and the new love of her life screamed at each other repeatedly. I did attempt to ignore the racket for a couple of weeks, but would finally lose my mind and began banging on the wall. I was shocked that it worked, but only the first time. All the others after were ignored. This garbage went on for over 3 months, and after several visits from the cops, she showed up at my door to apologize. She claimed things were going well, just as she had told me prior, but after he moved in, his behavior changed. After that, it seemed all they would do is fight. He had hit her during one, and she foolishly forgave him. He'd sworn it would never happen again, but it did, and she kicked him out. Her hope was that he'd move on to someone else. However, he soon appeared at her door out of the blue, begging her to take him back. The cops were called, and she filed a restraining order. That was almost a month ago, and she hoped he was gone for good. From what I could see and hear, things had gone back to the way they had been originally. I went back to living a peaceful life, and I assumed so had she. Considering we had opposite schedules, it wasn't strange for us to go weeks without seeing or hearing one another, and I was happy for it to stay that way. Then something terrifying would happen one day as I returned from work. I pulled into the complex and turned to enter my section of the lot and was blocked by several cop cars and ambulances. It was a surprising thing to see, but none of my business, I suppose. I found another spot to park and headed for my apartment. As I neared my place, I noticed my neighbor's door was wide open and cops were going in and out. After what she'd told me, I assumed her ex had showed up uninvited. Upon approaching our building, another officer stopped me and informed me the area was closed. I let him know I lived in the building and asked what had happened. He couldn't tell me, but if I waited for a detective to come out, he'd probably have some questions for me. The cop said something over his radio, and a minute later, a guy in a suit came out of the apartment and took me aside. He only had a few questions, if I'd seen anything and the like. As the seconds passed, I got increasingly nervous and begged him to tell me what was going on. He paused and said in a very serious voice that my neighbor had been found dead in her apartment earlier that day. My eyes had to have looked like saucers to him. I was completely shocked and wondered how I hadn't noticed something so major. Before he could ask the question, I blurted out her ex's name. They were familiar with him, and I could tell from his demeanor he was their main suspect. He handed me his card and let me go. I turned to walk away, but stopped a few steps later. "What's going to happen to her dog?" The detective hesitated, and a sad look popped up on his face. "The assailant appears to have killed him too. I'm sorry." I'm not sure why this angered me so much. Struck me as needless, I guess. The cops probably thought I was crazy, mumbling cuss words under my breath as I walked away. The following morning, I was browsing through the local paper online and came across a story about the murder. It explained that my neighbor was a week late on her rent and received a notice. When no reply came after 2 days, the manager visited the apartment personally. There was no answer, even after she knocked, so she let herself in and found the body. The detective was quoted as saying that they had yet to find her ex, and they believed that he had fled back to his original home in Lebanon. Not much information has come out since then. The ex-boyfriend is still unlocated and no other suspects exist at this time. I've moved on to a different apartment complex now, but for the remainder of my time in that one, things went back to business as usual. 2 months before my lease was up, new tenants moved in. This was a young couple with a 5-year-old boy. The noise coming from them was endless, and I was overjoyed when the time came for me to move. The place I'm now in is majority older couples, and the noise level is almost non-existent. As nice as things are at present, I don't believe I'll ever have a neighbor as good as her. Anytime I hear a bang on my ceiling or loud talking through the walls, I think back on her and how great of a woman and neighbor she was. I'm not sure of how common it was in your neck of the woods, but most people I've discussed the subject with had at least one kid whose dad would beat his mom in his neighborhood. My friend Mike was that kid where I grew up. I can count at least a dozen times from memory that I saw his mom with a black eye or busted lip, sometimes both. It was rare that Mike or his brother got knocked around, but if it did happen, the abuse was more in the form of hard spanking or whipping with a switch. I grew up in a rural area in the South in the 1980s. Some folks were just starting to take abuse seriously, but whether it was striking your child or your wife, most didn't want to get involved. You have to realize a lot of the old church people live by the spare the rod, spoil the child motto, and many of them, among others in the community, still believed a woman didn't get hit unless they said something they shouldn't have. It was an odd time indeed, but many others in my community despised any form of abuse and said so as often as they could. My parents were some of those, but let me play at Mike's house anyways. I'd see his dad every once in a while, and he seemed nice. He was quiet and not many words were exchanged between us, but I never saw any reason to be afraid of him, no matter what the adults around me told me. However, I did tend to be around later in the day after he had a few beers. Unfortunately, one day I would stay too long and see the man for who he truly was. That day, Mike and I had been playing a game on his Nintendo. I can't remember which one, but I got distracted and didn't notice the sun was going down. Back then, I could go anywhere in the neighborhood as long as I was back by dark. I had lost track of what I was doing, and the next thing I knew, I was running late. Cell phones were not a common thing in those days, so my mom couldn't just pick one up and tell me to come home. I started to panic because I knew I'd be in trouble. I threw down the controller and said bye to Mike. When I got up to open the door, Mike's dad flung it open and asked me where I thought I was going. I told him that I was late and needed to get home. The entire time, I was respectful and even called him Mr. Hughes like my parents had taught me to do when speaking to adults. He replied by saying that I was just a stupid little rat because I was already there. The words were slurred as he said them and confused me. I looked over at Mike, bewildered. His expression showed utter fear. I wasn't sure what to say, so I said nothing. I stared back at Mr. Hughes, hoping he was just playing a joke on me. His next words were, "What's wrong with you? Cat got your tongue?" These were just as slurred, and he swayed as he said them. That's when I saw the beer in his hand, and I became very afraid. If I could have shrank in size and rolled away, I would have. With the knowledge I had surrounding how he acted when drunk, I was sure I was about to be beaten for nothing. His eyes were very glassy, and he looked around hoping for someone to speak, but we were too scared. "Well, if you're not going to talk to your old man, go outside and help your brother pick up the stuff out of the yard." Instead of looking at Mike when he said this, he was turned toward me. I could only assume he mistook me for Mike. The real Mike was sitting just behind me on the floor, well within range, but I guess he was so drunk Mike was invisible. Or maybe he was so used to seeing double, he thought that was the case at that moment. I was about to correct him before I saw this as my way out. I did as he said, but rather than stop to help Mike's little brother, I booked it 3 houses down to my own and hid in my room. I got lucky that night. Neither of my parents heard me sneak in, and when they came to check on me, they assumed I'd been in my room the entire time. After weighing the pros and cons of telling them about what had just occurred, I chose not to. It wouldn't have achieved anything other than putting more unneeded stress on Mike and his family, so I let it go and counted myself fortunate. I'm not sure what happened when I left. Mike never mentioned it. The situation did teach me a lesson, however. I stayed away from his house, at least until his folks got divorced and his dad moved out. The family's life greatly improved after that, and Mike graduated valedictorian of our class. The man that would marry his mom later was an exact opposite of his father, and became the dad he'd always dreamed of. In the years since my childhood, the attitudes towards domestic violence has improved greatly. I, for one, can say I'm very pleased to see it. Children living in fear can never be a good or godly way to be, and because of this, I know I can be far more confident that my son and his group of friends will be less likely to find themselves in the same situation that I did. I've recently had to move to a new apartment because of a terrifying incident I had with another resident at my former one. He had become obsessed with me to the point that he tried to kidnap me at knife point and end my life. He's currently on remand in jail and will be for at least the next few years. However, his family is still living in the same apartment, and they have threatened me and my family more than once. My mom decided we would be safer if we left that complex, and in the middle of the night, last week, we packed everything we could fit in our car and slipped away. I suppose it wouldn't be fair to end the story there, so I'll include all that I can remember that led up to the attack. My mom and younger sister had lived in that particular apartment for around 7 years before I moved in. I've been living with my dad in California since my parents' divorce. I liked living there and didn't want to leave my friends. The only real negative was that I hardly ever got to see my sister. We both missed each other a lot, so I made the decision to move to Arizona with her and my mom. The day I arrived, I noticed a group of older boys, about 18 or 19, hanging out in front of their apartment. One of them sat under a tree staring at me. There was something about the way he watched me that made me very uncomfortable. This was Brett, and he would be the boy that very nearly took my life. Our first few times to see each other, he kept his distance. It would take around a month for him to introduce himself, and it was the circumstances that forced his hand. We ran into each other at the mailboxes. The surroundings pushed us very close together, and our eyes met. I still remember the feeling I had of indecision as I looked into his eyes. On one hand, he was a very handsome guy, but that deep-down feeling of mistrust was still there. He stared for a long moment before he finally introduced himself, and I did the same. He offered his hand, and we had a very awkward shake. That was the beginning of a short but eventually terrifying friendship. Our first day hanging out would be a fun one and no indication of how things would turn out. Brett remained shy for a little while, and on this day he wouldn't say much. I found myself making small talk to avoid any silence. He had told me about a wooded area close by that the other older kids hung out in, so I asked him to show me around. When we walked up, there were already 3 other kids, 1 boy and 2 girls, hanging out smoking. Brett and I stuck around for a little while and smoked with the group. By the end of that day, everything went well, and I'd made 3 new friends. He and I continued hanging out at the clubhouse, as the wooded area was called, and were getting along great until the day he asked me to be his girlfriend. The question caught me off guard. Honestly, although I thought he was good-looking, I wasn't attracted to him. We'd become good friends, and that was the way I wanted things to stay. I didn't want to hurt his feelings, so I tried to let him down as softly as I could. He took the no, much better than I expected, and quickly changed the subject, but did so in the most horrible way possible. He had seen a tabby cat walking about 30 feet away and picked up a handful of rocks. He began throwing the rocks at the poor creature. Fortunately, he missed each time. I was naturally appalled by this and yelled at him. He kind of just blew me off and walked away. With no one else to hang out with, I headed home, unsure of our friendship going forward. We ran into each other later in the week and tried to put what would have happened behind us. Brett's brother and a few others were swimming at the pool and invited us to join them, so we did. I ran back home and put my favorite swimsuit on. I rejoined them and jumped in the pool. I was having a good time splashing around with the others. It was over 100 degrees that day and the water felt great. I had stopped to get a drink of water and was talking to one of the boys I'd just met. Out of nowhere, Brett ran up to the boy and pushed him into the pool. Everyone, including the victim, began yelling at him, but rather than apologize, he walked off just as he had in the woods. When I caught up to him later, I asked why he had done it, and he said he'd become overwhelmed with jealousy. He had seen us speaking to each other, and I looked like I wanted him to be my boyfriend. A shudder of horror ripped through me when I heard this. If I was smart, I would have run away at that moment, but I felt sorry for him for some reason and assured him I had no intention to do that. The smile and look of sheer relief on his face should have been another red flag, but we've already established I'm not very smart. The rest of the day went fine, and nothing creepy would happen for another week. We had been playing Fortnite and smoking in a friend's apartment that afternoon when Brett tried to steal a kiss from me. This made me mad, and when I began yelling at him, he put on a sad face to make me feel sorry for him. If this would have been the first time he'd tried that, I may have let it go. But he had tried just the day before in the woods. No one was around to see it then, but this day, a room full of people saw. That was the final straw. I told Brett off and left. I never intended to speak to him again, but he arrived at my door the following day like nothing had happened. I let him say hello before I slammed the door in his face. My hope was that he'd get the point and leave me alone, but within hours, the apology texts began and would continue for at least another week. I very nearly answered one just to tell him to leave me alone, but my sister convinced me it would only give him hope and he'd never stop after that. The messages eventually stopped on their own, and for the first time in almost a month, I had reason to hope it was all over. Things around the apartment soon began to quiet down, and there were no signs of Brett outside. Being cooped up inside so long was starting to drive me crazy. Therefore, after I scanned the area around outside my place and across the way for Brett, I deemed it safe and took the short walk to the mailboxes. I stepped out of the door, walking slowly at first, ready to run back inside at the first sight of him, but the closer I got, the more confident I became. A few pieces of junk mail were all that greeted me. Feeling a tad more relaxed, I inhaled a lungful of hot Arizona evening air and made my way back to the apartment. I took a moment to tie my shoes. As I did, I thought to myself that this would be the perfect time for Brett to walk up, but when I finished and walked on, he was nowhere to be seen. I could see my door when I turned the corner, and then, out of the near darkness, Brett stepped out from behind the wall and grabbed me. His hand quickly covered my mouth before I could scream, but when I felt the sharp point of the knife, I lost any will to. He shuffled us back behind the wall and told me he needed to talk to me. When we were safely hidden, he slowly pulled his hand away. I could tell he was watching and waiting for me to make any noise. However, the presence of the knife resting just under my neck prevented me from doing any more than whispering. He claimed he wasn't going to hurt me. He only wanted to talk to me and explain how he felt about me. The knife made me think otherwise. I asked him as quietly as possible if that was true. Why was he attacking me with a knife? "This is the only way I could get you to listen to me." His reply was quick and confident. The shy and reserved Brett was elsewhere. The knife had apparently instilled him with a sense of power that he lacked without it. This realization terrified me even more and left me with little doubt he would use it if he felt a challenge to that power in any way. I decided at that moment I was going to do anything necessary to get away from this alive. "Well, I'm listening. What do you want to tell me?" When I said this, I used the softest feminine voice I could muster. I also relaxed my body to give him the idea that I was complying willingly. He said there were far too many distractions where we were. He was going to take me to the clubhouse so we could be alone. I stifled the chill as well as I could. The only thought I had was that he was going to take me there and kill me. If this was the case, I was going to attempt to get free whenever I could, even if I had to kill him to do it. He followed behind me as we walked towards the woods, pressing the point of the blade firmly against my spine the whole way. As we traveled, he told me about how he had fallen in love with me the second he saw me and how angry he felt any time another guy talked to me. I said nothing this entire time. In truth, I was doing my most to block out what he was saying and looking for my chance to get away. We drew closer and I could see a campfire burning off in the distance. My God, how long has he been planning this? Was my only thought. When we reached it, we sat together on a long log. He stared longingly into my eyes and talked about how much I hurt him by refusing to be his girlfriend. He had held on to that hope that I would see we belonged together and got the idea if he kissed me, I'd realize it sooner. For a brief moment I forgot how I had been brought there and a feeling of pity crept in my mind, but it was fleeting, and the seriousness of my predicament returned. What he would say next convinced me that my earlier suspicions were true. Our time apart had proven to him that I would never really be ready to accept our destiny together, and he was a fool to ever think a girl so beautiful would ever want to be with a screw-up like him. A dream he had showed him that if we died together, things would be better. When he said this, he hid his face and tears began falling from his eyes. He raised his hand with a knife in it to wipe the tear away, and that's when I took my chance. That split second he looked down and took the knife away from me was all it took. I turned and began running as fast as my legs could carry me. It was dark, but I had made the walk back and forth enough to know what set of lights in the distance belonged to home. Only once did I dare glance back. He was uncomfortably close, but I gave it all I had, knowing if he caught me, I was dead. I neared the edge of the trees and could see the lights of the complex growing closer. I began screaming for help. The burning in my legs was becoming unbearable, and I knew I couldn't go much further. The parking lot neared, and then, poof, a mass of bright lights flooded all I saw before me, and I ran into something. The something grabbed me and picked me up. For a second, I thought he had caught me, and this was the end. I screamed as loud as my burning lungs would allow me. I was not going to die silent and meek. A voice calmly told me it was all over and put his hand on my head. I looked up one last time, confident my defying eyes would be the last thing he saw, but the face was not Brett. It was an older man with a bushy mustache. Our eyes met. "It's okay. I'm a police officer. You're safe now." His words were the sweetest I'd ever heard. I went limp and wailed with relief. A relief I hoped to never exceed. The nightmare was finally over. My mother and sister wrapped their arms around me. We held each other tightly and cried like babies. They got worried when they saw the mail on the ground and called the cops. I glanced over to see a police officer with his knee in Brett's back putting handcuffs on his wrists. Another led us over to a waiting ambulance where I was checked out and eventually cleared. Brett was taken away, and when the time came to determine his bail, it was decided not to give him any. So at least until the trial date, he will be stuck in jail. God knows that's where he belongs. Since this all happened, we had repeated problems with Brett's family. They hold me responsible for what occurred, like I'm some heartless tramp that led him on and caused him to have a nervous breakdown. They egged my mom's car and broke our windows. Even after we called the cops on them, we had no proof they were the people doing it, so they got off. The entire situation became more trouble than it was worth, so we moved to our new place. It's only been a few months since this occurred, and from what the district attorney tells me, it'll likely be over a year before the trial begins. Any updates won't be for a long while. However, if anyone is interested, I'll post any new information I get. Please, everyone, wish me luck. And for all that is holy, let's pray this monster never gets to victimize another girl in his life. Has your neighbor ever once tried to kill you? Mine did. Want to guess why? Because my dog defecated in his yard once. Once? Yes, once. This dude has been nothing but trouble since I moved in. He would strut around without a shirt on in summer and occasionally flex and then look around to see if anyone was watching. You would think a guy trying to appear as macho as possible would be a man's man, but this was not the case. Anything that required any real physical labor, except for lifting weights, was done by his wife, a woman who was maybe 110 pounds soaking wet. I may have given him a pass on the lawn mowing. Maybe he had bad allergies, but that wasn't it. They owned this ridiculous jacked-up truck with an annoyingly loud exhaust, and you know who did all the maintenance on it? The wife. She had to use a stepladder just to get in the thing. When I realized he was just something to look at and had no bite behind his bark, any fear I may have had of him faded away. Enough of the small talk, though. The point of this whole post is what happened one quiet Sunday morning as I stepped out to get the paper. 9 times out of 10, my wife's little furry rat of a dog, is actually pretty cool, follows me out of the door when I go to retrieve it. This morning was one of the 9, and while I searched the fading darkness for my paper, he pranced off to the grassy area alongside the driveway to relieve himself. I thought nothing of it at the time. It's something that happens occasionally, and when I notice he does, I return from the house with a bag to pick it up. Not even I like dog feces in my yard, but I generally don't go Super Saiyan when I see it. They gotta go somewhere after all. Anyway, after I found it, I returned to the house with my paper. I noticed out of the corner of my eye the yappy bugger was in the familiar stance and I'd have to come back and pick it up. So I grabbed a bag and head for the door. This had to have been 30 seconds from dump to door, maybe. I reach the door, and before I can grab the knob, my neighbor comes banging on it. Not a kind knock either. This is 7:30 in the morning. Everyone else in the house is still in bed. So his loud knocking and yelling, yes, there was yelling too, made me angry before a word was even said between us. I open the door and he starts ranting about how my dog just took a huge one in his yard. I automatically tell him to lower his voice, but he kept on with the yelling. I tried to explain to him what I was doing. I even showed him the bag, but he continued. I push past the idiot and go to pick it up. When I find the pile, I see that it's actually well within the bounds of my property, so I get even angrier than I already was. I dispose of it in a nearby trash can and turn to go back in. This whole time, I'd been swallowing my feelings, but then he made a big mistake. He threatened to hurt the dog if it ever came into his yard again. This was something I couldn't let pass. I may make jokes about the little thing, but my wife loves him like he's her own child, and I love my wife, so even if it was only a threat, I knew my wife would be upset if she heard it. I got in his face and started yelling threats back at him. When he began poking me in the chest with his finger, I reflexively pushed him away, and he fell right on his back end. He stared at me speechless with a look of shock on his well-moisturized face. Now that he'd shut up, I assume he got the point, and I could finally go back inside my house. I foolishly thought that was the end of it, at least for the time being. However, less than 2 minutes later, he starts pounding on our door again. By now, my wife had awakened and was in the kitchen asking me what was going on. I forgot to mention this whole time that furry bugger was barking his head off. My wife picks him up to calm him down, and I storm to the door, ready to strangle this idiot. When I yank the thing open, the psycho is standing there with a gun and actually takes a shot at me. Just by a hair, the bullet zips past my head and comes incredibly close to hitting my wife. How he missed at that near of a distance, I don't know, but I'm incredibly thankful he did. I slammed the door closed and expected more shots to come roaring through, but none came. I ran for the phone and saw my wife had already called the cops. They tell her that there's been a few calls from the area and cars had already been dispatched. They show up and we tell our side of the story and show them the bullet in the wall. The guy couldn't deny he'd fired a gun. The proof was right there, and a few of the other neighbors had made complaints about someone shooting, so they put the cuffs on him, and we watched as they took him away. Later in the day, his wife came over and apologized to us for all the problems. I've never had a problem with her in the first place and told her so. She thanked me and let me know that they were going to be moving. The truth of the matter was they couldn't afford the house anymore, and with what he'd just pulled, they were going to need all the money they could to hire a lawyer. She didn't say much else after that, just apologized once more and left. Less than a week later, they were gone. It wasn't long before another family moved in, and they've actually been great neighbors. Although the entire comedy of errors was what it took to get rid of him, I'm still not sure my wife and I, almost getting killed, was worth it. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data. Located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to always separate the fart from the fartist.